Here's something worth running as a small experiment. Take two backyards on the same street, both with feeders hanging from a similar branch, both filled the same morning, both with comparable cover nearby. Watch them for a week. One feeder pulls in cardinals, chickadees, finches, the occasional woodpecker. The other is dominated by pigeons and starlings, with seeds scattered across the ground and a thin film of waste under the pole. Same neighborhood, same kind of feeder, different community of birds. So what's actually doing the sorting? It isn't the feeder. It isn't usually the location either, at least not at the level most people assume. The variable doing most of the work is something almost nobody examines closely before they buy it. It's the bag. The question I want to walk through today is a practical one, but it has a layer underneath that's worth slowing down for. When you choose seed, you aren't just choosing food. You're choosing which species will dominate the space around your feeder. Some seeds attract a wide range of birds, some attract a narrow range, and some, sold under perfectly reasonable-looking labels, mostly attract pigeons, doves, and starlings, with everything else giving the feeder a polite pass. Let me show you how to read the bag. The obvious answer to "what should I buy" is to grab something labeled wild bird seed and assume the manufacturer knows what they're doing. And technically, those bags are not lying. The seed inside is, in fact, seed. Wild birds will, in fact, eat some of it. But the phrase wild bird seed is doing a lot of quiet work on the front of those bags. It isn't a recipe. It isn't a standard. It's a marketing category. What's actually inside can vary enormously, from a thoughtful blend dominated by sunflower and millet to a bag that is largely grain, sorghum, and wheat dyed with a little oil, to make it look like a premium mix. Here's what most people don't realize, until they've watched a feeder for a few months. Birds are pickier than the label suggests. They don't eat what's there because it's there. They eat what they prefer, leave what they don't, and the rejected seed either falls to the ground, gets kicked aside by birds digging for the good stuff, or sits in the feeder until it spoils. So the right question isn't, is this wild bird seed? The right question is, which seeds are in this bag, in what proportions, and which species do those seeds actually feed? Once you start asking it that way, the answer to which seeds are worth your money gets a lot clearer. Let's start with the seeds that consistently bring in the widest range of birds, the ones experienced feeder watchers tend to converge on without anyone needing to run a controlled study. The first, and the one most worth anchoring a feeder around, is black oil sunflower. It has a thin shell, a high oil content, and a kernel size that almost every common feeder bird can handle. Cardinals take it, chickadees take it, titmice, nuthatches, finches, sparrows, even some woodpeckers will work it. If you had to choose one seed and one seed only, this would be it. The thin shell matters more than people give it credit for. The seeds with thicker shells, like striped sunflower, screen out smaller birds because they can't crack them. Black oil opens the door to almost everyone. Closely related, and worth understanding as its own category, is hulled sunflower, sometimes called sunflower hearts or sunflower chips. This is black oil sunflower with the shell removed. The advantage is twofold. First, almost every bird that can't crack a shell can still eat the meat inside, so you broaden your audience further. Second, you eliminate the shell pile that builds up under a feeder, which can suppress grass and harbor mold over time. The trade-off is cost, and the trade-off is shelf life. Hulled sunflower spoils faster once it gets wet. If you're refilling often and keeping the feeder dry, it's hard to beat. Then there's nyjer, sometimes spelled Niger, often sold as thistle. It's a small black seed that finches in particular are built to eat. Goldfinches, house finches, purple finches, and pine siskins in some regions will line up at a nyjer feeder. In a way they generally won't at a sunflower feeder. The catch is that nyjer requires its own feeder, usually a tube with small ports or a mesh sock. Put it in a regular feeder and most of it ends up on the ground. Put it in the right feeder and you'll see a finch community form that you didn't know was in the neighborhood. Which brings us to safflower, a seed that solves a specific problem. It has a bitter taste that many of the larger, more aggressive feeder birds don't bother with, but cardinals, chickadees, and house finches eat it readily. If your feeder is getting overrun by grackles or starlings, switching part of your supply to safflower often quiets the crowd without losing the birds you came for. It's not a magic solution, and some grackles will eat it anyway, but the pattern is consistent enough that it's worth knowing about. White proso millet is the 5th food on the list, and it deserves a careful note. White millet is genuinely valuable, but it works best at ground level, or on a low tray, because the birds that prefer it, juncos, native sparrows, mourning doves, towhees, are mostly ground feeders. Put white millet in a hanging tube, and most of it gets kicked out by birds looking for sunflower. Put it on a platform or scatter a small amount on the ground in winter, and you'll start to see species that were ignoring your feeder entirely. 6th is peanuts, either shelled and chopped or whole in the shell. Peanuts are protein-dense and pull in jays, woodpeckers, titmice, chickadees, and nuthatches. They're particularly useful in cold months. The one thing to be careful about is moisture. Peanuts spoil fast and can grow mold quickly if they get damp, and moldy peanuts are one of those things you don't want birds eating, ever. Use a feeder that drains well, and don't refill it until it's empty and dry. And the 7th, which I'll bundle as a category, is suet and mealworms. These aren't seeds, but they belong in this conversation because they fill a gap that seed alone can't. Suet brings in woodpeckers in a way that nothing else does, and mealworms, particularly in spring, pull in bluebirds, wrens, and robins that may never touch your seed feeder. They're worth considering as a second offering, alongside whatever your main seed is. That's the working list. Black oil sunflower, hulled sunflower, nyjer, safflower, white millet on the ground, peanuts, and suet or mealworms as a supplement. Stock those in some combination that fits your yard and your budget, and you have a feeder setup that will draw a real range of birds. Now here's where the investigation turns, because the more interesting question isn't which seeds are good, it's which seeds are quietly tilting the community at feeders all over the country toward pigeons, doves, and starlings without their owners realizing it. The first is red milo, sometimes called grain sorghum, the small, reddish-brown, round seed you'll find as a major ingredient in many cheap mixes. In most of the country, the birds you probably hoped to attract will not eat it. They'll dig past it. They'll knock it out of the feeder. It will accumulate on the ground, and the birds that will happily clean it up are pigeons, doves, house sparrows, and in some regions, Eurasian collared doves, none of which are bad birds. But if you bought a bag hoping for cardinals and chickadees, and your feeder turns into a Milo dispensing station for the local pigeon flock, that's the bag's doing, not the birds. The second is wheat, which shows up in cheap mixes as a filler for similar reasons. It's cheap to produce, it bulks up the bag, and a similar narrow set of species will eat it. Most of your songbirds won't. The third is trickier, because it isn't bad in itself, just frequently misused. That's cracked corn, especially when it's the dominant ingredient. Cracked corn does have a place. Some sparrows eat it, doves eat it, ducks eat it if you have them. But when it makes up the bulk of a hanging feeder mix, what happens in practice is that grackles, starlings, and pigeons will dominate it, and finer feeder birds will skip the feeder altogether. Cracked corn used sparingly on the ground, where ground feeders can pick through it, is fine. Cracked corn as 40% of a hanging mix is a different story. This is where the picture gets clearer. The cheap wild bird mix problem is rarely that the cheap mix contains bad seed. The problem is that the cheap mix contains a lot of seed that the birds you're hoping for will reject, which then either falls to the ground, attracts a different community, or rots. Before we land on a conclusion, there's one more layer worth looking at, because no list of seeds is a guarantee. A feeder in Arizona, a feeder in Maine, and a feeder in Florida will not produce the same community, even with the same seed. Your local species pool, the time of year, what's in bloom or seeding nearby, and which birds are migrating through, all push the results in different directions. White millet that pulls in a flock of juncos in a Pennsylvania winter may sit untouched in a Texas summer. Nyjer that feeds dozens of goldfinches in late summer may go quiet in spring when the birds disperse to nest. This isn't a flaw in the seeds. It's the system working as it should, and it's a reminder that the best seed strategy is the one that adapts to what's actually in your yard, not the one printed on the bag. So we come back to the question we started with. Two feeders on the same street, drawing two different communities. What does the seed bag actually decide? It decides the rules of the room. It sets the menu, and the menu invites some species and quietly turns others away. A bag heavy on sunflower, with thoughtful smaller portions of nyjer, safflower, millet, and peanuts, sets a menu that a wide range of backyard birds want to read. A bag heavy on milo, wheat, and corn sets a menu that mostly appeals to a narrower group, and that's the group that will dominate the feeder. None of this makes pigeons or doves the villains. They're doing exactly what the bag invited them to do. The work, if you want a different community, is upstream of the feeder at the moment of buying. So here's the next step in the investigation, and it doesn't require changing a single thing about your feeder yet. The next time you're in the store, before you buy anything, turn the bag around and read the ingredient list. Look for sunflower at the top. Look for milo, wheat, or corn making up most of the mix. Notice how often the front of the bag and the back of the bag are telling different stories. The feeder will tell you the rest. Give it a few weeks with better seed, and watch which birds start showing up that weren't there before. That's where the answer lives, not in any list, but in your own yard, on your own mornings, with whichever community the bag finally invites in.